you won't hear on the CBC. Lord Christopher Monckton, expert on the issue of global warming, climate change, or the mythology. Even to question these theories does make one a heretic now in contemporary Canada. And what I find particularly worrying, and there was a case just recently when we all had to turn the lights off for a short period of time. There were children, it happened to a friend of mine, there were kids outside screaming, "Turn your light off, turn your light off." There were young pioneers in their red shirts under communism. So a generation of young people being educated that to question these views on climate change makes you a sinister individual. Just to make sure people understand what we're talking about here, pollution is a different issue.
Quite right. This is a very central point that you raise, and it needs to be made very clear. All of us, properly speaking, are environmentalists now. We all realise that the footprint of humankind in various ways on the planet can be very heavy. We are cutting down rainforests when, frankly, we should be preserving them because they're wonderful sources of life and all sorts of other things. Oxygen, they keep the planet cooler around the equator than it would otherwise be. Many, many purposes in the rainforest. Wonderful biodiversity, as the trendy phrase has it, lots of different species living in these tropical forests. It's a tragedy when they're cut down. That's a bad one. The Prince of Wales, for instance, who bangs on about all these issues, is right to bang on about that one. Likewise, the encroachment of humankind upon fragile habitats of rare creatures is another concern, whereby simply through being too numerous and too intrusive, we are wiping out species that might otherwise have survived. We are throwing out into the atmosphere various kinds of industrial pollution, though that is much better controlled in the West than it is, shall we say, in China or India, because we've been at it longer cleaning up our act. So we are, in various ways, making a bit of a mess of the planet. Not as much of a mess as the environmentalists would have us believe, but we are making a mess. And those are real environmental problems which require to be addressed, and in the West largely have been addressed or are being addressed. But the global warming thing, this is where the environmental movement has overplayed its hand. For the sake of money, power and glory, it has said, right, we're going to try and sick the world on this ludicrous notion that a tiny change, and it's so far been a change in the composition of the atmosphere, just 1/10,000th of the atmosphere has been altered from being something else to being CO2. Over the last 250 years. Maybe another 2,000th of the atmosphere will become CO2 over the next 100 years at most. That's all. It's a tiny, tiny change in the composition of the atmosphere that we are achieving because we're putting out CO2 into the atmosphere. It is harmless. There was 20 times as much CO2 in the atmosphere in the Cambrian era 550 million years ago than there is today. I remember it well. You don't, you're too young. But there is the thing. We've seen this all before. It's nothing new. It's a very limited problem. But let's now see it, just for a moment, from the point of view of the bedwetters. I know it's difficult to cast one's mind into such a strange frame of mind, but let's just try. Let us for a moment pretend, ad argumentum only, that there really is the magnitude of warming for a given tiny change in CO2 concentration that the bedwetters would have us believe, the UN and all that crowd. Okay, in that case, assuming that they're right about 3¼ degrees Celsius of warming for the doubling of CO2 that will happen over the next century, century and a half, how much CO2 would we have to stop emitting in order to prevent a temperature increase of, let us say, 1 degree Celsius? Now, if I ask you that question, and your honest answer will be, I don't have a clue. Is that right?
It would be.
Right. Now, that's interesting. You are not stupid, are you?
I don't think
and
so.
You're not unaware of what's going on around you. You have heard there is a global warming debate. Isn't it puzzling that those who are trying to tell us that we need to do various things to mitigate or control or reduce our emissions of carbon dioxide have not given us the one piece of information that we would need to have in order to work out whether what they're saying makes any sense, which is how many tons of CO2 must we forego in order to reduce temperature by 1 degree Celsius, let us say? The answer turns out to be 2 trillion tons. Now, the trouble with numbers like trillions is that these are beyond our ken. But let me try and put it in perspective. The US emits in total per year only 30 billion tons. That's 30,000 million, compared with the 2 million that we would need to forego just to reduce temperature by 1 Celsius degree. The world as a whole maybe emits 100,000, 100,000 million tons. It's 100 billion tons a year. So if we shut down the entire carbon-fueled economy of the world, and let's suppose that we could do that without shutting down the rest of the economy. I don't think so. If you shut down the carbon-fueled economy, you have virtually no electricity, you have no locomotive power, planes can't fly, cars can't run, trains can't run, everything shuts down, and you go back to the Stone Age. For how many years has the whole world got to go back to the Stone Age in order to prevent 1 degree of warming, even on the assumption that the UN's exaggerated figure for the effect of CO2 on warming is right? The answer turns out to be about 20 years of total shutdown of the economy to reduce the temperature by 1 Celsius degree, even then only if the UN is right about this. So to stop the 4 degrees of warming that the UN says is likely to happen over the next century or so, you have to forego 80 years worth of that century and have no industries at all, no economy at all, for 80 years. That is just how little impact mitigation can have on this problem. It is orders of magnitude cheaper instead to go for what's called adaptation, where if and when the oceans that have failed to warm as directed for the last 60 years start to begin to warm, if and when the sea level that hasn't risen at all for the last 4 years rose only 8 inches in the last century and might rise at best a foot even on the UN's own figures this century, even if all these things were to happen, adaptation to these events, if they happen, would be orders of magnitude cheaper, far, far cheaper and far more cost-effective than trying to reduce the amount of CO2 we emit. That's called mitigation. And you can also put it the other way around. I have obviously had to look at various items of public spending when working for Margaret Thatcher, deciding which ones were worth it and which ones were not. And if I look at the list of the sort of things that taxpayers' money gets spent on by governments, and it's a pretty horrifying list of things, a lot of which they shouldn't be spending money on, but we won't go there. We'll just confine ourselves to this simple point, that trying to mitigate global warming, even if it's on the scale that the UN imagines, is the least cost-effective use of taxpayers' money for any purpose that has ever been devised in the history of taxation, which is a long one. It is the least effective. There is no purpose in it whatsoever except wanton economic destruction. Recently I went to talk to 100,000 mine workers and their families on a mountaintop in West Virginia. It had a splendidly biblical air about it, the whole event, and there was an enormous stage with cameras and lights, and so everybody at the back could see, because there were huge screens with my physog, you know, blown up to even grosser size than it already is. And I told them, I said, there is no basis for your government saying to you that coal trains are death trains, as one of NASA's spokesmen said recently, or that the coal industry deserves to be bankrupted, as President Obama said in an incautious moment when he hadn't realized the microphone was turned on during his election campaign. And all these mine workers who do one of the most difficult and dirty and dangerous jobs in the world are terrified that their jobs are about to be taken away by this lunatic administration. There's no point in calling it anything else. There is no rational basis for this hatred of the coal industry that the environmental movement and the Obamas of this world have conceived. And yet these are real people with real jobs, keeping the lights on that are shining on us today. And they are now threatened with the extinction of their jobs. And worse than that, we are all threatened with the extinction of our economy.